Hello students, today we are going to talk about public relations campaign. But before we do so, let us first discuss briefly about what communication is. Communication, as we know, means sharing of information, sharing of ideas, sharing of emotions. Communication also means establishing commonness between individuals who are participating in communication. These can be receivers of communication, and this can also be the source of communication. As we know, the communication process has certain elements. Source is one such element. Source is that element of communication from where communication or messages originate. The second element of communication process is message. Message is the ideas that source communicates to the receiver. For instance, I am giving you certain messages right now through television. These are messages. The third element of communication process is channel. Channel can be either through air, for instance in face-to-face communication, or channel can also be through technology. For instance, right now we are using the channel of television for communication between you and me. The last important element of communication is receivers or audiences. For instance, you are the receivers of communication right now. For effective communication, the source has to understand the receiver's requirements, the receiver's needs, the receiver's state of mind, the receiver's reference or frame of reference. There is yet another element of communication that any good source has to keep in mind, and that is the feedback. Feedback is the reaction that the receivers of communication generate, and that reaction goes back to the source. The other most important element of communication is the context in which communication occurs. For example, a communication between two individuals in a bazaar is the context. The context also influences the dynamics of communication between individuals in interpersonal communication. The context is also important in mass communication. There are at least three different forms or kinds of communication that one has to keep in mind. The first kind of communication is interpersonal communication. It is also known as face-to-face communication. In face-to-face communication, the source of the communication and the receiver of the communication are in front of each other. The advantage of this communication is that whatever the source of the communication says, the receiver reacts, and the feedback from the receiver reaches instantaneously to the source. The advantage, as I said, is that the receivers can modify his messages to the receiver. That is the advantage of interpersonal communication. The second kind of communication is group communication. In group communication, there is one source, but the number of receivers is fairly large. It can range from two or three to as much as 20 or 30. A good example of group communication is a classroom situation. For instance, if I were talking to you in a classroom, that would be group communication. The advantage of group communication is that the receiver of the source of the communication can understand and also can receive the feedback from the receivers, and it can go back to the source of communication. The third kind of communication, which is widely prevalent in society, is mass communication. For instance, the kind of communication that is happening between you and me right now through the channel of television is a good example of mass communication. It is important for us to spend a minute in trying to understand what does mass mean in mass communication. Mass, one of the meanings of mass is that it refers to audiences. Audiences which are widely dispersed. For example, either in television, radio, or newspapers, the audiences are widely dispersed. A newspaper published from one center is read by audiences located in different cities. Same is the case with radio. A radio station generates a program, broadcasts a program that is listened to by individuals and groups of people that are widely dispersed. For instance, BBC, the programs, radio programs and news telecast by BBC is heard almost all over the world. The other meaning of mass is that the use of technology. That is, unlike in interpersonal communication where the source and the receiver are in front of each other, in mass communication, a technology of communication or communication technology is made use of. As you know, we discussed some time ago, take the instance of radio. In radio, we make use of radio towers. In television, we make use of, again, television stations and, television broadcasting signal, mechanisms. So the use of technology mediates between the source and the receiver. The source and the receiver are widely separated both in space and in time. We have so far discussed three different forms or kinds of communication. The first is interpersonal communication. The second is group communication. And the third is mass communication. Irrespective of the form of kind of communication, all communication are broadly put to two or three different uses. The first is disseminate information. The second purpose for using any of these three different kinds of forms of communication is disseminating news. The third and an important function of communication is entertainment. Most of mass communication, whether radio or television, is used for entertainment purposes. So one can conclude that the functions or purposes for which mass communication is used is to disseminate information, to give out news, and entertainment. The other thing that we need to understand about communication is the context or the application of communication media. Communication is used for selling ideas and services. Such a use of communication whereby products or ideas or services are sold is known as advertising. We have seen ads in newspapers, we have heard advertising on radio and television. Advertising is a very predominant use of communication. The second purpose, the second application area of communication is rural communication. Here we use communication for improving people's lives. One can correspondingly also talk about urban communication. Here we are talking about improving, again, people's knowledge, changing attitudes and behaviors. In urban areas as well as in rural areas, we would want people to stop smoking. This is one example of using communication in the context of urban India or in urban areas. One can call this urban communication. The third important application area, of course, is public relations. You know that public relations is broadly used by organizations and by governments. These are two broad and main users of public relations. What is public relations? The definition of public relations is a planned, deliberate, and sustained effort to build bridges between organizations and people so that both the major publics or stakeholders in this process arrive at a mutual understanding. It is to build a sustained relationship between the organization and its citizen and its publics. Public relations effort have to be planned because there is a lot of money and energy that is involved. You have to plan to make correct choices about media. You have to plan how to use messages. You have to tailor your messages to meet the public's or audience's specific requirements. That is the reason public relations efforts will have to be planned. Why should public relations be deliberate, planned, and sustained? Public relations efforts have to be deliberate because you cannot act on the spur of the moment. Public relations programs and efforts are directed at meeting some strategic and policy objectives. They need to be thought through. A conscious effort has to be made so that public relations messages reach the right kind of audiences and publics. That is the reason that public relations efforts will have to be deliberate. Lastly, public relations efforts have to be sustained. They have to be sustained because public relations is a continuous process. Advertising is not a continuous process. Public relations, on the other hand, is a continuous process. You have to keep communicating with different publics all through the time. We know that publics can broadly be classified into internal publics and external publics. Internal publics are your employees. Organizations have to keep talking to the employees, have to keep understanding what their changing needs and requirements are, and these have to be communicated back to the organization. That is the reason public relations has to be a sustained effort. What are PR campaign objectives? How are they set? And campaign objectives are directly derived from the organizational objectives. Let's take an example of pulse polio. The overall policy or program objective of the pulse polio campaign is to eradicate polio from among the population, from all over the world as well as from within India. If that is the program objective of the pulse polio campaign, what can be the PR campaign objectives? An important public relations campaign objective is to make people aware that there is vaccine available for this disease that can prevent children under the age of 5 from being afflicted by this disease. That is the first objective. It relates to awareness. But it is not as simple as that. Some people may be aware of the availability of vaccine, but they still may not be interested or keen to take this kind of a vaccine. That attitudes may not be favorable to acceptance of this message, to get their children immunized by this vaccine. In such instance, the second public relations campaign objective is to change people's attitudes in such a way that they get their children under the age of 5 to relevant places where their children can be vaccinated. The third objective, and an important objective from the public relations point of view and also from the programmatic objectives point of view, is to change people's behaviors, so that if they are required to take 2 doses of the vaccine or even more, they can continue doing so. So these are the 3 kinds of objectives one can think of when you have a theme such as pulse polio. Public relations objectives are both short-term and long-term. If this is decided by the public relations managers and by the organization. If the task before the organization is too big, is too huge, then perhaps the PR campaign can run for a few months or maybe a few years, in which case it is a good idea to break the communication or the PR objectives, campaign objectives, into short-term objectives and long-term objectives. Sometimes it is possible, given the context, that your PR campaign can be seasonal. For instance, in the case of malaria, we know that there are several places in this country where malaria is rampant, especially during the monsoon season. So PR campaign objectives in this sense can be very seasonal. That is, you would launch a PR campaign in certain pockets, for instance tribal areas, during or maybe before and during the monsoon season. You don't have to run this campaign during summer seasons or during the months of, let's say, February, March or April. In such instances, public relations campaign tends to be seasonal. So public relations campaigns can be short-term, they can be long-term, and they can also be seasonal. The second characteristic of public relations campaign is that it is time-bound. You can't have a campaign has a fixed beginning, a campaign has a fixed end. It is now also necessary to make a differentiation between public relations campaigns and public relations events. A campaign, as we have discussed before, runs on a continuous basis for a certain period of time. You focus your energies, you spend more money than is required to meet certain public relations campaign objectives. So public relations campaigns, by definition, are time-bound. A third important characteristic of public relations campaign is that it is addressed to specific publics. That is, you need to segment your publics. You need to understand who are the people who are the main audiences of the PR campaign and who are the people who are the secondary audiences of the PR campaign. Let us go back to the pulse polio example. Although the target of the pulse polio campaign is to get children immunized, children can't by themselves come to the booths where they are inoculated or vaccinated. In such instances, the primary audience of the public relations campaign is the parents of those children who need to be educated about the benefits of vaccinating their children. In certain instances, the primary audience can be the adults. Let's take the example of HIV/AIDS. If we think that in certain parts of this country that HIV/AIDS is caused mainly due to taking drugs by young people who are above the age of 18 or 20, then the primary audience in such instances is those individuals who are taking drugs. So one way of segmenting your audiences is by differentiating between primary audiences and secondary audiences. Sometimes one way of differentiating your audiences is on the basis of where they are located. For example, there are certain pockets in Gujarat, for instance, where tribal communities are apprehensive of getting their children vaccinated for pulse polio, whereas there are several regions and parts of several regions in this country where people have no inhibitions of getting their children vaccinated. In such instances, we have to differentiate our audiences or our publics on the basis of where they are located. The third way of differentiating your audiences or publics is on the basis of either their income, their education, or their lifestyle. For instance, if you have to design a public relations campaign for people who smoke, then you have to look at the smokers' lifestyles. In this instance, you have people who smoke and people who are passive smokers. That is, people who don't smoke, but they, in any case, inhale the fumes or the smokes that are emitted by smokers. So, on the basis of lifestyle, on the basis of income and education, you can differentiate your audiences. The important thing in public relations campaign is to segment your audiences. If you are doing public relations for an organization, such as a manufacturing organization, then it is a good idea to differentiate first between internal publics and external publics. In the internal publics, you can, for instance, differentiate people between who are working at different levels, people who are working at the shop floor level, people who are working at the managerial level, people who are working at the top level. But where would you classify or categorize a person who is a trade union leader? This person may have very little authority, but he has a lot of power. So that is one way of differentiating your internal audiences. The other example can be in terms of external audiences. Media is a very important external audience or publics from the public relations organization's point of view. Newspapers, media can be divided into newspapers and television and radio. Within newspapers, you have general language newspapers and English newspapers. Within English newspapers, you have specialized newspapers like, say, Economic Times or Financial Times, and you have general reading newspapers like Times of India and The Hindu. You have also magazines. So a good idea, a good way of differentiating publics is to look at the classification and subclassification based on the amount of interest or the specialization that a public shows and the purpose such publics can serve your organization's needs. A fourth important characteristic of any public relations campaign is the use of media. There are certain things that we need to keep in mind when we select media. The first is that we have to select media or a combination of media, which is more appropriately known as media mix. How do we select media? We select media based on our publics. If we have to reach rural population, then we are pretty aware of the fact that rural people don't read much newspapers. So there is no point in choosing newspapers as the main source of communicating our messages to them. If the target is rural population and the message is that they need to get their children vaccinated, then what are the media that one can use? For instance, one can make use of rallies, one can make use of group meetings, one can make use of house-to-house campaigns. These are the important media that one uses when one has to reach rural population. What are the media that one uses when one has to reach urban audiences? Radio and television are the mass media. These media are important for creating awareness, for disseminating information. But if we have to change their attitudes and behaviors, then we have to conduct group meetings with them again. We have to motivate them so that they accept our messages and change their behaviors accordingly. In any case, what is important for any public relations campaign is to use a combination of media. There are media that are known as little media, for example, posters, banners, handbills, bus panels, panels that are put behind buses. And there are other media that are known as big media or mass media. These are radio, television, newspapers, even internet in certain cases. A combination of such media will facilitate achievement and attainment of certain PR objectives. That is as far as the media is concerned. One has to keep in mind what are the messages that one needs to pass along. For instance, if the message is too large and too long, and there are messages, different parts to the message, then perhaps you can't make use of hoardings. Then maybe newspaper advertisements are very helpful. So based on the messages that one has to communicate, based on the kind of publics or audiences that one has to reach, and also given the budget that a company can devote for public relations campaigns, you choose your media. But media are very important, without which getting the messages across from the source to the receivers and to different kinds of receivers cannot happen. The other thing about public relations campaign is that no public relations campaign is complete unless it has been adequately monitored and it has been evaluated. Monitoring is something that happens when the communication campaign is going on. For instance, you start a public relations campaign in the month of March, and you want to complete that campaign in the same year, but in the month of December. So the communication campaign is on for a good 6 to 8 months. In such instances, you need to find out regularly at different points in time what is the kind of influence that this campaign is having. Is the message, are the campaign messages reaching the audiences? Are the audiences receiving those messages? Are they understanding those messages? Are their behaviors changing according to what you wanted? All these activities are part of public relations monitoring. The other thing is public relations evaluation. Evaluation, by definition, happens at the end of the public relations campaign. So if the campaign has ended in the month of December, you would want to find out what is the influence of, what is the communication effect and influence of this campaign. Have people actually become aware? How much have they become aware? Have people become aware, in the case of pulse polio, that vaccine is available, that polio can be prevented? That is one thing that you need to find out. That is known as communication effect. To what extent has their knowledge increased? To what extent has people's attitudes and behaviors changed? Have they actually gone and vaccinated their children? The other thing that happens in the case of evaluation is something that is known as program evaluation. That is, if people's behaviors have changed, if people have accepted your messages and have acted accordingly, what is the impact? Has the incidence or the prevalence of pulse polio actually come down? This usually also happens at the end of the campaign. For instance, we know in the case of pulse polio campaign that the number of people who are presently afflicted with pulse polio is about 2,000 or even less. When the pulse polio campaign was launched, we knew that the number of people afflicted were in thousands. So at the end of public relations campaign, when we evaluate these campaigns, we can say in quantitative terms that the number of people who were afflicted by disease has come down from, let's say, over 10,000 to 2,000. In that sense, we have evaluated the effectiveness of the campaign itself, the effectiveness of the program. The last thing about public relations campaign is that these have to be action oriented. What do we mean by action oriented? Some of the examples that we have taken so far all come from the field of health. If you were to disseminate messages that vaccine is available and available at a certain place, but if vaccine actually is not available, then those messages will not be very helpful. In other words, action-oriented public relations campaign mean that adequate services have to be made available along with dissemination of messages so that people can access those services and can behave accordingly. In summary, what we have discussed in this session is that public relations campaigns are very time-bound, are very focused and specific activities carried during a certain period of time for achieving predetermined goals.
ఈ మన ఉన్నత విద్యా కార్యక్రమాలపై మీ సందేహాలు, సలహాలు, సూచనలు పంపవలసిన చిరునామా డైరెక్టర్ ఆడియో విజువల్ ప్రొడక్షన్ అండ్ రీసెర్చ్ సెంటర్, డాక్టర్ బిఆర్ అంబేద్కర్ ఓపెన్ యూనివర్సిటీ, ప్రొఫెసర్ జి రామిరెడ్డి మార్గ్, రోడ్ నంబర్ 46, జూబ్లీ హిల్స్, హైదరాబాద్ 500033.